Okay, so let's get started back. And so let's start with polls the result. So we got this from everybody, and yeah, the result is that the A and B are the same percentage, and then C is more. So that means that many people thought that it's unclear between the brighter room and also darker room. And some think that you are more conscious in the brighter room. Does anybody have any ideas or opinion about this? Any thoughts?
So I voted unclear.
Yeah, I voted unclear as well.
Why?
I thought it would be reductive to say you're more conscious based on the fact that you can't pick out things in your environment purely in the visual sense. I feel like a lack of sensory input in one of the 5 sensory modalities shouldn't make you any more or less conscious. I don't think someone who has an accident becomes blind, halfway through their life suddenly becomes loses their an aspect of their consciousness. I feel like it's void of kind of ablation of one of the sensory modalities.
But is it similar to the view that the consciousness can't come to the degree, can't come in degree then?
I would think, and I'm not sure. I remember now you gave us human perception as a phenomenon of quantization, that paper by Dietrich Ertz, I think it was. And I feel like I wonder to what extent you can ever really, what if you can't really measure consciousness at all? What if it can exist both as a binary and as a kind of scalar quantity or a vector quantity, something that can be measured?
Okay. Does anybody have any opinion or questions about this? Otherwise, yeah, then please, Andrew, if you want to give your answer or.
Oh, well, I said unclear because I think, so my view is that it depends on what consciousness is and whether bright experiences have more of whatever that is than dark experiences. And I think we just don't really know. It certainly seems not obvious introspectively to me. What would IIT predict?
So as far as I can tell, IIT would predict that it should be the same. And as long as that subject feels to the same level of the subjective feeling of you are conscious. And the point here is that unlike what you have mentioned as a sort of the attention scheme theory, right? For IIT, it really doesn't matter whether what matters to IIT is more to do with possibility, whether you are in one state out of really many. So I actually wanted to ask you about your atomic slide thing in relation to that. Can you share your slide?
Let me.
Yeah, this one. So for this, what I want to ask actually is, do you think that there is an organism that can only see the color of blue?
I think there's at least a possible organism that, you mean that there are only possible conscious experiences at all?
Yeah.
Not just only possible color experience, but only possible conscious experience for any kind of experience?
Yeah, the latter.
I don't see why, I don't see any reason for ruling that out.
Okay, so the way IIT considers this kind of thing is that to see this as blue, then you need to have all the possibility that is not blue. And then you should be seeing it as one of this, which is related to other color in a particular way, that defines finally that this is blue.
Mm-hmm.
So without having other possibility, how can this organism know that it is blue? That doesn't make sense to me. It's sort of similar to the defining a word without having any other possible words, and then to define or to understand the position or relation of this particular word in relation to others, you can't have a concept of something.
So one thing is there's a shift from talking about which experiences are possible to what we can know or which concepts we could have. But let's just talk about which experiences are possible. What do you think about the following as an analogy? So it seems to me possible that there could exist a world with just a blue object, with no objects of any other colors. So when we're thinking about colors and understood as properties of external objects instead of experiences, it doesn't seem like there's the same sort of intuition in terms of, it doesn't seem like there's the analogous intuition there. Or would you want to say that it's impossible for there to be a world with just a single blue thing?
I would say, so first of all, so there are probably a couple of things I should say. Let me take a perspective IIT, and also plus my original kind of thinking, right? So about the color experience, it's all made in the brain. It's not true to say that there is a color, objective color in the outside of the world, right? We agree that there is some kind of wavelength distribution outside of the world, and that is processed by this brain and through eyes and the thalamus and brain, and that when they enter into certain states, then we perceive that as blue, right? And then what I'm trying to say with this diagram is that the states of the brain needs to have at least a different kind of possibility, and then when it enters into certain state, then that can finally gives rise to or correspond to experience of seeing the blue. So if your brain is already wired up to have a possibility of all other possible color experiences that we can have right now, and we enter into this world of where everything is blue, then that's very different from asking about sort of the having a brain that doesn't have this kind of structure. So if we are talking about this kind of a brain situation, like we have right now, to go into this only blue world, then I think at least momentarily we should be able to see blueness. But if you don't move your eyes, or if everything is homogeneous, then many things just fade away. So we probably start losing blueness really quickly. But that's a more empirical side of the issue. So to be more philosophical, it depends, I think, on the structure of the brain.
Well, I think that's something that everybody would agree with, though. If at least it seems. Well, so I want to maybe here's a few distinctions to put on the table. So one question is whether brains with different kinds of structures are going to necessarily be associated with different kinds of experiences. So that was the last thing that you were saying, and that seems very plausible to me. But another thing is whether there could be a cognitive system that has only a blue experience. I mean, you could accept the first thing while denying the second thing, or sorry, but while also accepting the second thing. So you could think that, yeah, of course, having different kinds of brain structures will lead to different experiences, but there's some brain structures that enable only one experience. So I think at least those two questions should be disentangled. And then there's also a question of whether it's the
Mm.
relations rather than monadic properties that characterize or individuate or
Mm.
specify the nature of the experiences. So in terms of your views relative to mine, I think that both of us agree that differently structured brains will have different kinds of experiences. You want to say that the single blue experience brain is impossible, whereas I want to be agnostic. And then for the relational thing, I think you want to say that the essence of the experience is given by its relations to other experiences, whereas I want to say, no, there's this intrinsic quality to the experience that isn't just due to the relations.
Yeah, I agree with your summary, and also I agree with you, our sort of the distinct point. And just to come back to where we started off, which is the answer to this question of a brighter room, dark room, and what IIT would say, because the brain's states in let's say super complicated brain and in awakeful states, you can imagine that it can go into a very complicated kind of structure or state space, and then just one point among this really many possible state is the state that you are in the dark room, which is very, very distinguishable from other places, as distinguishable from the bright room. So each of them are, in a sense, equally unique and informative and integrated, and therefore it should be it's the same level of consciousness degree, but the contents are different.
By the way, just on the point about IIT, I think that it's interesting to think about the real connection of what I was discussing to IIT. I didn't mention it in this talk. I very briefly talk about it in the paper. I mean, personally, I'm somebody who's very agnostic about IIT. Most people are like on one extreme or the other, like really pro IIT or against it. And I'm one of the few that's more in the middle. But one way in which I think this can help discussions of IIT is that some people have been quite critical of IIT because it posits this degreed phi value and takes that to be a measure of degree of consciousness. And some philosophers have said that, well, it's not so clear this makes sense, and have been skeptical of the idea of degrees of consciousness, and have suggested that there has to be some analysis given by IIT theorists of what exactly that amounts to. And I guess I'm maybe a bit more in favor of IIT on this issue, at least insofar as I don't think there's any theoretical disadvantage that they incur by positing degrees of consciousness. I think there's a question of whether that is a real feature of consciousness and whether we should take phi values to correspond to anything interesting in phenomenology. But the mere fact that IIT theorists are appealing to phi values and talking about degrees of consciousness, I don't think is a reason to reject the view. Instead, I think it's just an interesting claim that the view makes that, we can look at in a holistic manner. So that's sort of connected to this slide where I said that, look, I don't think we should take it as either a starting point, that consciousness does or doesn't come in degrees. Instead, it's just going to depend on the theory that we consider and favor. So that's sort of how I think about the connections between this material and IIT.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Okay. So then with that, I think, is there any question from the student in particularly with this stuff, or in general with respect to sort of the interdisciplinary research or career path of Andrew? Or I want to also broaden up a little bit about this, kind of a conversation into something like your future study. there are a couple of options to discuss for the rest of the time. One is that you said consciousness could be either zero dimensional or infinite dimensional or somewhere in between. That's something that I was kind of curious to hear more, if you don't mind. And then the other thing is that what is your view about sort of the philosophy or philosophical approach to consciousness? And also another possible thing to discuss would be, what the students of this lecture can take out from this conversation, especially from you, philosopher.
Yeah, well, for the dimensions thing, that's something that I'm working on at the moment. I guess the approach that I'm taking is sometimes you see people claim that consciousness is multidimensional in the consciousness literature in a way that suggests that it's obvious. And I guess I don't find it obvious. You also sometimes see people contrast a multidimensional approach with the levels of consciousness approach, where the idea is that instead of thinking of consciousness in terms of the single scale, we think of it in terms of this multidimensional space. I guess I'm kind of skeptical about there being a genuine dichotomy here. I think that as with any phenomena, we can adopt different kinds of models of that phenomena. And in some cases, the model will be richer, and in other cases, it'll be sparser. Basically, what I'm saying is that sometimes you see people talk about dimensions of consciousness or assert that consciousness is multidimensional in the consciousness literature, but there hasn't really been any kind of rigorous systematic analysis of what that actually means. And the way I'm going about this is right now, I'm thinking just much more generally and abstractly about what it means to say a property of any kind is multidimensional. And then I want to apply that to consciousness. So it's a similar kind of methodology to what's being used here. I thought a lot about what degreed properties are in general, and then ask, okay, in the case of consciousness, what should we think? And how can we assess which view is actually true? But for this stuff on dimensions, it's still in early stages, but hopefully I'll have something more concrete by next year. You were talking about what was the second?
The second one is more to do with philosophy or philosophical approach to consciousness. What kind of specific contribution philosophy can make? What do you think is towards the consciousness study?
Well, one way I think about it is that consciousness is just really conceptually difficult. I mean, that's something that basically everybody recognizes. There's a lot of different senses of the term consciousness, and part of, I think, the philosopher's job has been to disambiguate and analyze these different senses. For example, access consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness, or self-consciousness versus phenomenal consciousness, or, in popular media, sometimes people even conflate consciousness and intelligence. And I think part of the role of philosophers is to bring conceptual clarifications, like between those different kinds of notions. I mean, that's a pretty simple case. That's just a case to illustrate why it's important to be careful about our terms and to disambiguate different terms. But I think there's more subtle cases where we can ask, what exactly is the claim of, say, a higher order theory of consciousness? What exactly are they committed to? What kind of picture of consciousness are they giving us? I think also, there's issues that are more in the vein of what I was doing here, where we take kind of a nebulous starting point. Are there levels of consciousness? And try to think about that really carefully. And I mean, speaking for myself, the kind of work that I'm most interested in doing is stuff that tends to be quite philosophical, but I think has connections to the science of consciousness. I think this is one case where, the material in the article that is published it's for philosophers, but I think it's quite of interest to scientists. There's a lot of consciousness research that invokes the idea of degrees of consciousness in one way or another, that sometimes takes it as a starting point. And we could ask, is that a good starting point? And if so, what exactly is the meaning of degrees of consciousness in a given context. Or if we're thinking about dimensions of consciousness, that's another case where you see that sometimes invoked in the consciousness literature, but it's not always clear exactly what the claim actually is or what it's what it's meaning to express. So I guess I think of the role of philosophers as sort of just trying to clean up the conceptual and theoretical space and sharpen things and systematize things as much as we can, so that we're less hung up on semantic disputes or conceptual confusions, or just trying to, get clear on those sorts of things and can focus more on the substantive, interesting questions that give us different kinds of pictures of consciousness. I guess that's I could say more, but that's one aspect of how I think about the role of philosophy. And I mean,
that's good.
Yeah, and the very first thing I was saying is that consciousness compared to many phenomena is just so difficult to think about. It's one of the hardest problems that there is, or one of the hardest phenomena to study. And I think that when you have that kind of situation, philosophers tend to become more helpful.
Okay, that's great. And then, is there anything that you want to say to students about what to take from this lecture, or if there's one thing you want them to remember in general? Not necessarily need to be about this lecture, but also as a sort of perspective with a from a person who kind of went from different kind of field to field, and then now doing this, and then still doing new types of the study, like combining math and also philosophy. I thought that you would be in a very unique position.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer or discuss anything that anybody has specific questions about. Maybe in the case of consciousness, this is something that was sort of being brought out by what we were just talking about, but there's a lot of different paths you can take. If you're somebody that's interested in consciousness, then there's obviously philosophy and neuroscience and psychology, but there's all sorts of ways, I think, of studying consciousness. And one thing that I think is becoming more and more the case in consciousness science, you can tell me if you agree with this, but I feel like there's more and more cross-disciplinary discussion and cross-disciplinary work. And I think that's ultimately good because, ideally we would want philosophical work to be scientifically informed in the relevant ways, and scientific work to be philosophically informed in the relevant ways. So I guess I'm somebody who is quite pluralist, and I think, yeah, it's great that there's lots of different methods and approaches being taken.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say and wanted to say. Can I share the slide?
Yeah.
So that brings us, in a very nice kind of end of this lecture series, I would say, because this is the slides that I kind of prepared for the last lecture. And consciousness research is quite interdisciplinary, as you saw from today's lecture, that we have a collaboration with philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, and also biology, pharmacology, development, clinical science, evolution, linguistic, cognition, and information theory, robotics, engineering, artificial intelligence, mathematics, computer science, and physics. And in particular, today's topic, you saw the surprising connection, in a sense, that philosopher who is interested in consciousness talking about quite this abstract mathematics concept of the total order and the partial order, and Andrea has worked on other things as well. And we were talking about category theory, in fact, in the background. And so there is some when new things comes out, then there's always also new combination or new relations forms out, and that prompts us more of the evolution or progress in this field or understanding of the consciousness. And with that, I also wanted to give you a kind of the disclaimer of this class, that views that I provided, or Andrew or Alex provided last week as well, are highly simplified. And so potentially it's misleading or biased. It's just from one person's view, and there are lots to learn. And not only this course, but everything you learn in the university is likely to be revised in the future. So I know that many students want to learn facts that stays indefinitely for the life, but unfortunately that's not gonna be the case. Recently I learned that every 30 seconds there's one medical paper published, and that's like 11 times faster than just like 10 years ago or 20 years ago or something like that. And can you hear me still?
Yep.
Something like that is happening also in different fields as well. The more interdisciplinary the field becomes, many things will be revised, and the consciousness is very likely to be one of these fields. So consciousness is so fundamental that maybe some of you before the class may take it just as granted, and you even don't understand why this matters or how mysterious it can be. But something that is super fundamental, like is there a degree in consciousness, that's still like hot topic and discussed a lot, as you saw in Andrew's lecture today. So consciousness, I would say, is potentially one of the best study materials to improve your skills to reflect, critical, empirical, quantitative, and logical. And then that's the purpose I thought I would be, teaching to you through the class. So I think this kind of, critical skills will be useful for your future, regardless of the direction that you take. And with that, that's my last word. Is there anything that you guys want to ask as a question, or Andrew to add?
I mean, I think everything you said is right. And yeah, I mean, part of why I got interested in consciousness, and I'm sure it's similar for you now, is we understand so many things in the world quite well at this point. We have well-developed scientific theories of all sorts of things, but consciousness is the phenomena that seems most intimate to us, that's closest to our existence as just creatures in the world, yet it's one of the phenomena that we understand least. And I think that we're still very much in early days of studying consciousness and developing a science of consciousness. And I think that's interesting and remarkable and exciting.
Yeah, with that, I think we can close this class. Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you guys for joining the class, and see you sometime. Bye. And I'll stop the recording.